Erik Solheim was a pivotal member in facilitating peace talks between the Sri Lankan government and the LTTE. In this interview, we'll be discussing Mark Salter's new book, To End a Civil War, Norway's Peace Engagement in Sri Lanka. The book provides an impressive in-depth analysis regarding the various players that were involved within the conflict, and gives a very insightful view regarding the events that occurred both at the negotiating table and during the battle, which ultimately led to the LTT's demise. Most interestingly, the book acknowledges a rivalry between Ranil Wickremesinghe and Chandrika Kumaratunga as it pertains to the peace talks.
In the book, we basically identify two main obstacles to lasting peace from that peace process. One was the divide between the two main political parties in Sri Lanka, the Sri Lanka Freedom Party and the UNP, symbolized with the divide between the Prime Minister and the President. And the other obstacle was the lack of vision of Mr. Prabhakaran to accept federalism at a time when federalism was offered in Sri Lanka. If we zoom in on the divide in the Sinhala politics, of course that goes long time back to the 1950s when these two parties split. There has been a fierce competition between the two parties throughout, and very often the narrow gains of one party has come as an obstacle to peace, meaning that if a politician from one party wanted to reach out to Tamils to find a lasting solution, the other party would, for the most narrow gains, oppose it. And true, that divide was a main obstacle to peace also when we were involved from about 1998 onwards.
0 hours on 23rd February 2002, a ceasefire agreement enters into force between the government of Sri Lanka and the Liberation Tamil Tigers of Elam, LTTE. The ceasefire document, signed by Sri Lankan Prime Minister Wickremesinghe and LTTE leader Prabhakaran, has been deposited with the Norwegian government, and we have been asked to make the agreement public.
First year after the ceasefire, there was not one single killing in the entire island of Sri Lanka, and even for a number of years after that, the level of violence was much less than it was prior to the ceasefire, as well as after the ceasefire. So it created an enormous optimism at the time. It was a great relief, and people also felt that now is the time for peace. Unfortunately, the two parties didn't grab that chance, but in 2002, 2003, there was huge optimism.
Did Mr. Wickremesinghe or Mrs. Kumaratunga have a constructive plan to win over the nationalist elements in the South if the LTT had openly agreed to federalism?
I am of the opinion that if the two leaders, Chandrika and Ranil, and the two parties, SLP and UNP, had been able to force a joint opinion or a joint view, handling the extremist Sinhala forces would not have been that difficult. Later, these extremists became maybe more vocal and more important, but at the time they were rather marginal. But of course, as long as the two main parties did not work together, it was very, very hard. But at that time, some of the extremists were there, but they were weak and would not have been able to stop any agreement with the LTT at that time if the two main parties had agreed.
Chandrika in the book said this about the Norwegians: "My complaint was that they were very secretive with us, the government, and that was very annoying. John Westberg, Erik Solheim, all of them who were involved, they were doing things in this country without telling us and then announcing them to us as an afterthought. I think they were naive to the extent that they did not understand me. I found that they were passing on everything, and Ranil was misusing the details by passing them on to the press, who would then work up the extremists." What is your response to her statement?
I guess she may refer to the period when Ranil Wickremesinghe was calling the shots in the peace process around 2002-2003, and she may have felt that we were not as open as we should have been to her at that time. I cannot recall any major issue which was kept from her, but if she has that feeling, I can only regret that we were not able to keep her more informed. But largely over time, we kept all the major players involved and informed about everything. We kept her informed and her ministers when she was in charge, and we kept, of course, Rana as opposition leader informed when she was in charge. So we did our very best to keep everyone in the loop. But true, the core of the peace process between the LTTE and the government could, of course, not be made public. Neither the LTTE nor the government wanted us to go out in media, etc., to reveal everything which was said.
Prabhakaran summarily dismissed Chandrika's offer to reconstruct the North in the mid-1990s. Why do you think then did the LTTE essentially make it a priority several years later to discuss the reconstruction of the North and East prior to discussing substantive issues during the Civil War?
I think for a number of reasons at that time the LTTE took a somewhat more favorable view of the UNP as compared to the SLFP. One was the private view of Mr. Balasingham, the chief negotiator, and of course also a very influential man within the LTTE. Balasingham felt very, very close to Mr. Hamid, the foreign minister of Sri Lanka during UNP times, at the time of the talks with Mr. Premadasa, who was then the president, so he came to know him and trust him, and this also to some extent spilled over to a certain trust in the UNP as more favorable or a more favorable view of the UNP as compared to the SLFP. Now the matter may be the distrust coming from the talks between Chandrika and the LTTE around 1995 after her huge electoral victory, and I think it was 1994. Then, as we know, there were talks. There was an exchange of letters between the LTTE and the government at the time, and that also reduced any trust between, at the time, Chandrika and the LTTE.
In the book, it documents several differences between Anton Balasingham and Prabhakaran. Poignantly, that Balasingham believed LTT's killing of Rajiv Gandhi was their biggest mistake. To what extent do you believe there was a divide between Balasingham and Prabhakaran, and what influence do you believe such a divide had on preventing a permanent agreement on being formed?
They were like an old couple who had known each other for their entire life. At least, I mean, they joined hands in the late 1970s and worked together through uphills and downhills after that. So in that sense, they trusted each other and worked closely together. They had the disputes. At some points, they didn't talk to each other for months, but they always found back to each other. They both needed each other. I mean, Balasingham was not the leader of the struggle. He could not replace Prabhakaran. He had no military experience nor any wish to work on military matters. On the other hand, Prabhakaran had very limited understanding of the global picture, did not understand the thinking in Delhi or in Washington, and frankly was somewhat of an amateur on the political issues. So when they combined the forces, they were a very, very strong team. Separately, neither of them could lead the struggle. But I think with the benefit of hindsight, very clearly, if the LTTE had followed the advice of Balasingham, they would have achieved a lot more. And the killing of Rajiv Gandhi is, from any point of view, of course, both morally and politically, as stupid as it can be. I mean, if you are a rebel group in Mexico, if you start killing the President of the United States, you are in deep trouble. And then there are a Tamil rebel movement who for long had received assistance from India. Killing the Prime Minister of that big, important country is such a blunder and such a crime that it's hard to understand.
Was there anyone in the LTTE leadership that could have been convinced of the virtues of federalism other than Balasingham?
I think at the end of the day, Prabhakaran called the shots. So when he didn't refuse. He never said no, but he was reluctant, dragging his feet. So rather than grasping the opportunity, no one else could have convinced Prabhakaran and Balasingham. He was in a very different position from the rest of the LTTE leadership. remember that Balasingham was 10 years older than Prabhakaran, had a long experience and a long life before he joined the LTTE, while nearly all other top LTTE leaders had been recruited by Prabhakaran. The other leaders were by and large 10 years younger than Prabhakaran, recruited by him, had learned the military from working with him, so they were very junior to him and could hardly present unwanted advice. The only person who was in a position to really bring to the table of Prabhakaran advice which was not requested was Balasingham, and he did that for long, and it served Prabhakaran very well as long as he listened to Balasingham.
Should the Norwegian team have asked India to help in getting the GOSL to put forth a united front regarding settling the civil war?
Yeah, maybe, with the benefit of hindsight. I mean, we knew that we could not resolve the problems between the Sri Lanka Freedom Party and the United National Party. That could only be done by others. So clearly we requested others to bend some arms and do more to bring them together. That was not our mandate. Because India was very reluctant to be involved in any direct sense in Sri Lanka for very obvious reasons. They had very, very bad experience with the peacekeeping, Indian peacekeepers or military personnel in the late 90s, which ended up in an open conflict with LTTE with more than 1,000 Indians killed. So they had burned their fingers. They were the big brother of Sri Lanka and did not want to be involved in a direct sense. But contrary to what most people believe, or many people believe, Indians were always supportive to all the Norwegian peace efforts.
Do you think there was support in the diaspora for the transformation of the LTTE from a military to a political force? And is it realistic to suggest that the diaspora had any influence on Prabhakaran?
Leadership matters. If Prabhakaran had told people this is the way we want to go, people would have followed. There would for sure have been people who would have been unhappy, but the vast majorities of Tamils, both in the diaspora as well as in Sri Lanka, and of course people in Sri Lanka matters more, would have accepted a federal solution.
So during the Oslo talks, Balasingham has stated that he would explore a federalist solution, and in the book it seems to suggest that this had received backlash among the diaspora, and Prabhakaran had gotten cold feet, and then he had pushed with the ISGA proposal. So in that regard, then would you say that maybe the diaspora wasn't so receptive to federalism?
I think as long as the diaspora had not got a clear signal from Prabhakaran, the uncertainty and the doubt was there. If Prabhakaran had taken the lead, the vast majority would have followed. That's normal in politics, and in particular, and very particularly so in a political military organization like the LTTE, where leadership matters even more than in other parts of society.
What did you make of the ISGA proposal put forth by the LTTE?
We saw it as a positive step because it was the first time the LTTE made its own proposal for a solution to the Sri Lankan conflict. Before that, interestingly enough, for the more than 20 years of LTTE existence, LTTE had never they had put forward some general principles about the right to self-determination, but had never explicitly said how that could happen. So we saw it as a major step forward at the time. However, of course, it was a maximalist proposal coming at a time where there were difficulties in the south, so it played into the hands of people in the south who didn't really want a solution, or didn't want a solution at the time. So it may have been a tactical difficult proposal at the time, but true, it was the first time such a proposal was put forward by the LTTE. But of course, Balasingham would have wanted a more flexible one, and the influence this was made by some Tamil scientists or professors from the diaspora working with the top leadership, and it had aura of being somewhat maximalist and inflexible, but still it was the first time a proposal was on the table, and it was a proposal which of course should be discussed, not taken as a take it or leave it basis.
Ranil Wickremesinghe wanted asymmetrical federalism, which would give more powers to the northeast, and it was a solution which would have been acceptable to all Tamils and a vast majority of Sinhalese. It would have made Prabhakaran Prime Minister of the area. Why wasn't the term asymmetrical federalism used explicitly during the peace negotiations?
The term was used by Ranil in different contexts and was by far the most open-minded and wide-ranging proposal made by any Sinhalese leader at any time for a settlement to the conflict. It was of course not used because no one really came into a discussion about the contours of federalism. We spent all the 6 rounds of formal talks on confidence-building matters, on relaxations of security measures, etc., etc., and there was no real in-depth discussion about federalism, what it would have meant. But clearly at the time, Ranil alone would not have been able to bring such a concept through, not even if the LTTE had accepted it. He would have needed a broader front in the south, which would have had to include the SLFP and Chandrika, otherwise it could not have worked.
Could you please help us understand Canada's contribution to the peace process? Particularly, can you elaborate on the contribution of Bob Rae and Professor David Cameron?
Sorry, yes. At the time when we were considering a federal solution, because that had been accepted in the so-called Oslo Declaration, and there was no final commitment by Prabhakaran, still there was a favorable discussion about that. LTTE delegations went abroad to study federalism in Spain, Germany, Switzerland, other places. Of course, the Federation of Federalism, which is based in, I think, in Ottawa, at the time it was headed by Bob Rae, offered their services, and we were very, very happy to accept. Canada, we also felt at the time, could provide a model in the sense that there is a huge French enclave, Quebec, as we all know, in Canada, where, not all, but which is mainly French-speaking, but within a Canadian federal settlement. So, well, though every nation is different, at least there were clear parallels with the minority status of Tamils in Sri Lanka and the French speakers in Canada. So they offered to provide lessons, to take Tamil LTTE delegations abroad to study federalism in its many forms. I mean, no one thought that you could copy Swiss federalism or Canadian federalism or Spanish federalism or German or Indian or whatever federalism, but that you could get insight from all these systems to devise a federal system in Sri Lanka. Bray was and his former federations was very, very helpful.
Mr. Kadirgama persuaded many Western nations to proscribe the LTTE and also spoke out against the practice of conscription of children.
How do you feel as an ethnic Tamil yourself to be so reviled by a group of Tamils?
Well, I see it like this. At birth, I was given a label. And if having been given that label, the LTTE, nobody else, the LTTE wants me to accept and approve everything that they do. The suicide bombers, the child soldiers, the political assassinations, the extortion of ordinary
But how does it make you feel? You've got to go around
I'm coming to that. Before I tell you what I feel, let me give you my rationale. Now, if being opposed to all that makes me a traitor, which is what they call me sometimes, I am absolutely delighted to accept that appellation. I do it with pleasure.
I disagreed with his view that it was helpful to proscribe the LTTE. Lakshman Kadirgama spent a lot of time going around in Europe and other parts of the world, convincing governments to do this with the aim of putting pressure on the LTTE and also as a reaction to evil acts of the LTTE when they had killed off someone. But still, I think it was a wrong strategy. We should have done exactly the opposite. The more contact with the LTTE, the better. The more different political leaders had been able to speak to Prabhakaran, the more chance there would have been to influence him into a political settlement. Remember that at the end of the day, there was one visit to Prabhakaran by the Commissioner of the European Union at the time, Chris Patton. I think Mr. Kashi from Japan visited him maybe twice, except for that, and Prabhakaran never met a Sinhalese, only once a Muslim delegation. Everyone else speaking to Prabhakaran were either Tamils or Norwegians. And I think that influenced his worldview. It was somewhat narrow. If Prabhakaran had been able to speak to a lot more leaders from the United States, from Europe, from India, from other places, it would have been a much better strategy. And I take this also to other parts of the world. Don't believe in disengagement. Please believe in engagement.
To what extent, in your opinion, did the Muslim issue for security pose a barrier during the peace talks?
That was a main issue, maybe not the most important issue, but for sure a main issue. The LTTE refused a kind of three-party talks. The LTTE said there are two parties to this conflict. This is about the rights of Tamils, and there should be a discussion between the government and the LTTE. Of course, the LTTE also accepted that there was a Muslim dimension. At the time of the peace talks, LTTE never claimed to speak on behalf of the Muslims, but they were very, very adamant that there can be not three-part talks. So what was agreed was that Muslim participation would be accepted within the government of Sri Lanka. Rauf Hakim, the Muslim leader of the time, was a part of the government delegation, and it was anticipated that at a later stage a more proper Muslim participation would be part of the peace talks. But we never came to that point, and I think this also was a mistake, because if the Muslims had been more included in the peace process, they would also embrace the peace process. Now the Muslims ended up as a very, very skeptical force because they were not involved, or not properly involved.
Balasingham had been sidelined and replaced with Tamilchelvan due to his moderate views. How, in your opinion, was Tamilchelvan a much different negotiator in comparison to Balasingham?
Of course, they were very different characters. Balasingham, much older than Prabhakaran, had been involved in politics even before the time of the LTTE, had been working with diplomats based in London, had very few leaders I have met who have had such a grasp of the international situation and global issues. He was simply a brilliant intellectual who would have been a brilliant leader in UK or Canadian politics or wherever he had been able to put his name forward. Tamilchelvan was a kind of spokesperson for Prabhakaran, never offered any personal opinion separate from what he had been told by Prabhakaran, and had much more of the role of kind of a press spokesman and organizer on behalf of Prabhakaran. And I doubt that Tamilchelvan ever would have given Prabhakaran unwanted advice, while Balasingham, of course, would a number of times tell the leader that I believe that you are on the wrong path, please, we should discuss and find some other way.
One of my favorite statements of yours in the book is the following, and I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about it and its relevance. What worried me then, and still does today, is how few there were and are in the Tamil leadership with an understanding of the political context of the South, or India, or the world for that matter. If you had that understanding, you wouldn't have killed Rajiv Gandhi, for example. It's striking how much more mature the Tamil diaspora is in economic, social, and cultural contexts than they are in their political understanding. I thought that statement just encapsulated just the entire...
I have been surprised about that many times, because to me the Tamil diaspora in economic and social terms, it may be competition with the Jewish diaspora of Israel or the Jewish diaspora, the most successful diaspora anywhere in the world. I mean, when you meet a Tamil, he will normally be a doctor or engineer or stockbroker or dentist or had huge economic success. A number of Tamils have come to my home. Norwegian Tamils have come to my home in Oslo and asked me, "Oh my God, how can a minister live in such a poor home? My villa is much bigger than your small apartment." So they have made fantastic success. Tamils nearly everywhere are much better educated than the average host population. But in political terms, there have been limited understanding. I mean, for instance, many Tamils thought, unfortunately, that manifestations against the way Rajapaksa fought the war at the end, where tens of thousands of people were marching in the streets of London or Toronto for sure, or Oslo or wherever, would push Western leaders to really stop the war. It was a huge mistake. It couldn't happen, and it showed a limited understanding of politics. And this was a very big problem for the LTTE after the death of Balasingham, because there was no one in the leadership with that understanding. But it's an enormously successful group, the Tamil diaspora, in economic and social terms, and not so much in political. However, now we have got a Tamil MP, I understand, in Garya Ananda Sangari, has joined the parliament in Ottawa, so it will be very interesting to follow his way of working there.
Karuna states that his departure was the starting point for the LTT's decline. Would you agree with this statement?
I think there's a lot of truth in that, yes. Because though Karuna was not particularly after he defected from the LTTE, was not a very impressive figure. He split the LTTE and brought a huge number of Eastern cadres with him. So the LTTE became much more of a northern Sri Lankan Tamil organization, and with a much less roots in the East. That had a negative impact, because also the fact that a number of those who split from the LTTE at the time took upon themselves the role as Tamil paramilitaries working with the armed forces of Sri Lanka, because a number of them would have given, I guess, good knowledge about the inner working of the LTTE. Would have been much easier for the armed forces of Sri Lanka to target LTTE operationals with the knowledge provided by Karuna and his people. So both from a military, but much more from a political point of view of the split between North and Eastern Tamils, this was very bad for the LTTE.
You talk about Karuna's defection. The Sri Lankan government side used the negotiating table to weaken the LTTE or the leadership of the other side, militarily and politically. Do you think the Norwegians were aware of that defection, that the government was working on Karuna?
Well, I think the Norwegians, like others on the ground, became aware pretty early on that there was a connection there, that Karuna, for example, the Karuna group's forces were operating out of government bases, military bases. But I would question the notion that the government used the peace process as such, meaning the talks, to weaken the LTTE. I mean, let's not forget that the point at which the LTTE agreed to go into the ceasefire and the whole process was a point at which they were militarily stronger than they'd ever been. I mean, after the attack on the airport in Colombo in July, yes. I mean, they were at the height of their military prowess. Now, many people say you only go into peace processes when you're weak, and that's where we had to have the LTTE, but they weren't. They were very, very strong. And until the Karuna defection, I don't think there was much indication of the LTTE being weakened militarily. Rather the opposite. The LTTE used the opportunity of the ceasefire, just like the government, to strengthen its, consolidate its military hold. Conscription went up, weapons were brought into the country, the LTTE used the chance of cadres being allowed out of the LTTE controlled area to be ostensibly doing political work, to do more than just political work. So everybody exploited the ceasefire. Everybody exploited the window.
But isn't it correct for the Norwegians to keep quiet, knowing that the government is working on breaking Karuna? Do you think they should have come out at that time, or to inform the LTTE or the world that the government is trying to, the government of Sri Lanka is at least not genuine, talking peace?
Yeah, I think that I mean, for example, I know that the Norwegians were approached quite early on by the Karuna faction, basically saying, look, bring us into the peace process, you know, as a separate, we're a separate entity.
Even before the breakaway?
No, I think this is this is after the breakaway.
Okay.
And the Norwegians basically said, we can't do that, not for any reasons of ideology, but just because the terms of their terms of reference didn't allow for that. I mean, to suggest that it was some kind of conspiracy or it was an attempt to leave Karuna over to the government side, I don't buy that. I think that Karuna's reasons for defecting were wholly to do with his relationship to the LTTE leadership and the things he himself had been getting up to in the East, in terms of possibly embezzlement and, you know, other stuff. I think the government, though, saw the opportunity that his defection provided very, very quickly and seized on it.
After the demise of his father, Erik Rajapaksa, Mahinda Rajapaksa took his first step into politics in 1968 as the SLFP organizer for the Beliata electorate. He first entered parliament by winning the Beliata electorate in the 1970 general election and was the youngest parliamentarian at that time. When the People's Alliance government came into power in 1994, Mahinda Rajapaksa became the Minister of Labour of that government. Subsequently, he became the Minister of Fisheries and Ports. Mahinda Rajapaksa became the opposition leader on the 6th of February 2001, and it was in 2004 that he became the Prime Minister of this country of the UPFA government. In the presidential election held on November 16, 2005, Mahinda Rajapaksa became the president of the country, and within a short period of 3.5 years, he vanquished the scourge of terrorism from the soil of this country on the 18th of May 2009.
Because we had dealt with Mahinda Rajapaksa for many years. First time I met him, I think he was the Minister of Fisheries, Minister of Labour, then later became Prime Minister. And at the time of Chandrika, we were informing him all the times about the developments of the peace process. However, Chandrika called the shots, and Rajapaksa was those days some mainly in the shadows of the big leader Chandrika. He had rarely offered very many opinions on the peace process. So we were very uncertain as to what he would want to do after taking power. Of course, he took power with the support of the JVP, which was a very nationalist force at the time, and on a very nationalist platform, but there was no way to know how he would act after becoming president. Clearly, Rajapaksa has some huge strength. He acts as a man of the people. If you want to send a politician to the rice paddies to speak to the farmer about the rice price or about how to get to the bus to Hambantota or to Matare, and no politician on the planet, maybe with the exception of Bill Clinton, can do it better. He's simply brilliant on these kind of grassroots politics, and we at the time had no idea how he would behave as the president. But it was, of course, another major blunder of the LTTE and Prabhakaran to stop the voting in Tamil-dominated areas of the Vani, and through that securing the electoral victory of Rajapaksa at the time.
Well, it's amazing that it isn't discussed more widely, which is this question of the election boycott in autumn 2000, the presidential election, when, as we know, the Tamils in the north and east boycotted the election, almost totally, and basically that margin of vote is what secured victory for Mahinda Rajapaksa over Ranil Wickremesinghe. Now, there are allegations that surfaced from very early on that this was the result of a secret agreement between the LTTE leadership and Mahinda for the boycott, and it was a backroom deal, and it had money involved, like how much do you want for boycotting the election? A figure was named, and that figure was paid, $20 million or thereabouts.
Norwegians are aware of this?
Absolutely, everybody's aware of it. It's been in the Sri Lankan media on and off ever since. But it's never, and Ranil Wickremesinghe even referred to it in Parliament quite recently, these allegations. But somehow it's never gone to court, it's never come out.
No substantiation,
no,
nobody has.
But why, I mean, beyond just making the details clear publicly, why I'm pushing the issues, because I think it's fundamental. I mean, if it is in fact the case that Mahinda, the man who destroyed the LTTE, came into power on the backs of a deal with the leader of the LTTE or his proxies, profound moral and political conclusions or lessons, or call it what you want. So there's some real reflection, for starters, that needs to be done amongst LTTE supporters, or then it's like, we can blame the final stages for the message and kind of, but what about that? Because if that hadn't happened, if Ranil had stayed in power, like the question you asked before, could have been a very, very different trajectory.
The cynicism of Mahinda Rajapaksa and the president of Sri Lanka, I mean, he was trying to portray himself as the great savior of the Sinhalese, but he was ready for any sort of dirty deal of any type if he could help his political fortunes. Tried to portray himself as a principled politician, but the opposite was the case. I mean, he, for instance, told me that he was ready to give the North to Prabhakaran, no problems, there would be no elections, he would just give it to Prabhakaran, but with two conditions. Number one, it should be within the Sri Lankan state, not a separate state, and the other condition was that there should be no protracted peace process, because he thought a protracted peace process would undermine his support among the Sinhalese. So he was opposed to a protracted peace process, but he was not opposed to a backroom deal, a big bang, where Prabhakaran was the chief minister of the North in such an exercise. Of course, absolutely contrary to what was his public statement. If you don't believe this, well, it's up to you whether you trust me or you trust Mahinda Rajapaksa. Because there were only two people in the room when this offer was made. But so that's, I can just leave it with you who you want to trust on this.
During late 2008, when there was rapid military advancement in Sri Lanka against the LTTE, why is it that you kept getting reports from high-ranking LTTE members such as Pulidevan stating that everything was fine, we don't really need Norway's help, and when Norway's role at that time was trying to prevent civilian casualties, why is it that you were getting reports from Pulidevan stating that everything was fine when they were clearly, in complete chaos?
I will ask you the same question. It's very, very hard to understand. The only answer I can give would be that was the message he was told by the LTTE leadership, that means Prabhakaran, to give, because they would know that these cellular phones would in all probability be surveilled, so that was not a secure way of communicating, but still to give a message which they would clearly know that we would not believe in for a second. It was very strange, because prior to that, of course, Pulidevan had been one of our main contacts. I had and still have a lot of respect for him. He was simply a very, very decent and good human being. So being put in a position where he was, telling them when you stand in the middle of the house which is burning, and you tell people that there is no need to bring in the firefighters, everything is fine. It's a very strange position to be in.
Norway tried to propose the ICRC to move into borderline areas in order to allow civilians to leave. Why wasn't there any adequate support for this by the LTTE?
What we tried to do at the end of the war was, of course, to save as many lives as possible. We wanted to save the life of all the Tamil civilians, but also the lives of the LTTE cadres, the rank and file of the movement, and for that matter the leadership. We wanted to save the lives of everyone. We came to a point, I would say around the turn of the year from 2008, 2009, early 2009, where there was no doubt whatsoever about the outcome of the war. Unless some absolute miracle or God intervention, there was no way the LTTE could but lose the war. So from that point onwards, we saw no reason to do anything which had any similarity to negotiations. I mean, the only way forward was to look into how can this war be ended in a decent fashion. And we asked the LTTE to accept what we call an organized end to the war, where all the LTTE cadres, all the civilians would hand themselves over to the ICRC, or if that was not acceptable, to the UN, or if that was not acceptable, even to India or the United States, but to some foreign body who would register all names with photos, so that when the war was over, it would be very, very difficult for anyone to go after them, killing them or harassing them. The LTTE did not accept such a concept. I must add that, of course, this was not a welcome idea by the government at the time either. What the government of Sri Lanka wanted was what happened, an all-out military route of the LTTE, and that was the favored solution. But if the LTTE had accepted an organized end to the war, the government would have been forced by India, the US and others to do it, and would have been no way. They could say, no, we need, if the LTTE said we are ready for an organized end, there would be no way the government could say that, no, we want to continue.
What did you make of Norwegian Ambassador Tori Hatram forwarding an offer of amnesty to the LTTE cadres, all except Prabhakaran and Puttu Aman?
That was what transpired from our informal discussions with the government, that there was no firm commitment, but that they were ready to give such an amnesty to everyone except Prabhakaran and Puttu Aman. But of course, if this had been accepted, it would still have been very, very difficult for the government to execute such high-profile people as Puttu Aman and Prabhakaran. Look to Turkey as a parallel, where Kurdish leader Öcalan, who was captured by the Turks, I mean, it must be now nearly 15 years back. Yes, he's in prison, but he's still a major figure in Turkish and Kurdish politics, and he has not been executed. So I think if such an amnesty had been accepted, everyone else would have been free citizens of Sri Lanka, and maybe Prabhakaran and Puttu Aman would have been in prison, but they would still have been alive today, and they would have a political influence for another day. But of course, these can only be absolutely speculative. I mean, we cannot know this for sure, but I think it was very, very sad that offer was not taken.
We were speaking to the LTTE by telephone to the Vanne, but more importantly to KP, which was then the kind of foreign minister of the LTTE, previously the chief weapons purchaser of the LTTE, and conveying this message. And we were told, I mean, I offered to go there, but more importantly, people like Ban Ki-moon offered to go there, top level foreign ministers. There would be no problem to send anyone there to discuss this matter with Prabhakaran. But we got a reply, please come, but you will meet with Mr. Nadesan, who was the head of the political wing of the LTTE. And of course, with Nadesan, you could not make this kind of deal, only with Prabhakaran. So I personally said, no doubt, there was a way. It would have been humiliating, for sure, for the LTTE, but it would have saved the lives of all these people, and they would have been able to fight with other means another day. As late as April 2009, 1 month before the final end of the war, KP, he was then in Malaysia. We had sent, we had agreed that he would come to Oslo, and we would discuss this organized end. We had even sent Norwegian security people to Kuala Lumpur to pick him up, but at the very last moment, Prabhakaran said, no, we shouldn't go. They did our utmost to convince Prabhakaran to organize an end to the war. He refused. We did not refuse. He refused. Indians did not refuse. Americans did not refuse. He refused. So we should put the blame where the blame should be put, and that's squarely in two places. It is with Mr. Rajapaksa, the president of Sri Lanka, and his brother Gotabaya Rajapaksa, and it is with Mr. Prabhakaran.
First batch of 30 Tamil political prisoners languishing in Sri Lankan jails will be freed on bail. even as over 200 inmates, including LTTE rebels, have resumed hunger strike demanding their immediate release.
I think there is no doubt that Sri Lanka should now very rapidly move to a point where all Tamils who are imprisoned should either be brought to court or be released. We are now 6 years after the end of the war, because it's not acceptable that anyone are imprisoned without any court procedure. So if there are anyone they consider criminal, please put forward the evidence and make a juridical process which is acceptable and keep them in jail. Everyone else should now be released.
A large percentage of our viewers consist of Tamils. What is the one message you would like to convey to Tamils of Sri Lanka in the diaspora?
That this is a year and a period of enormous opportunity in Sri Lanka. The skies are much brighter than for a very long time. There is a non-racist government of Sirisena and Ranil Wickremesinghe in the south, with a willingness to reach out. However, nothing will come by itself. Tamils must fight. They must fight hard. They must fight with non-military means, but only through a hard, sustained political struggle will Sri Lankan Tamils get what they desire and deserve, which is, number one, an equal status as citizens of Sri Lanka, and number two, the right to self-determination and self-rule in Northeast, but within a united Sri Lanka.